The year was 1819, and the corridors of Kensington Palace smelled faintly of lavender and polished wood. Outside, London hummed with smoke and steam, unaware that within these walls, a small girl had just entered a world of golden cages and whispered ambitions. Alexandrina Victoria opened her bright eyes for the first time, and though her cradle rocked gently, the weight of crowns, duty, and distant kingdoms seemed already to settle upon her tiny shoulders. If only someone, a kindly hand, a guiding voice, could help her navigate the maze of shadows that awaited, perhaps the girl could grow not only to wear a crown, but to carry it with a heart unbroken. The year was 1819, and the air of Kensington Palace carried both lavender and quiet apprehension. A tiny infant, wrapped in embroidered white linen, had been born to a mother far from her homeland and to a father already ill with fever. The child's name was Alexandrina Victoria, a name chosen to unite nations yet burdened by dynastic ambition. Her father, the Duke of Kent, a stern but gentle man, looked upon her only a few times before the sickness claimed him. His death left the young Duchess alone, dependent on narrow pensions and the unpredictable favor of the crown. Little Victoria would grow under the cold gaze of courtiers who doubted her, and the shadow of uncles who coveted the throne. In her nursery, the walls were hung with watercolor scenes of faraway castles. At night, her German governess whispered stories of virtue and duty, planting in her mind the seeds of restraint that would define a reign. But even then, the child's eyes held a brightness, the stubborn spark of one who would not bend easily. Outside, London pulsed with soot and progress. Steam carriages hissed in the streets, factories rose where gardens once bloomed. No one could have guessed that the small girl behind the palace gates would grow to become the emblem of an empire, and the prisoner of her own iron will. Victoria's childhood was not one of freedom or laughter, but of rules, observation, and isolation. Her mother, the Duchess of Kent, and her ambitious adviser, Sir John Conroy, devised what they called the Kensington system, a method meant to shape the young princess into a model of obedience, yet it became a gilded cage. Every moment of her day was controlled. She could not walk down a corridor without someone holding her hand. She could not sleep in a room alone. Even her meals and lessons were monitored by Conroy's watchful eyes. She was never allowed to play with children her age or visit friends. The world beyond Kensington Palace was forbidden, reduced to whispers through her window. Her only solace came from books and her faithful governess, Baroness Lesen, a sharp-minded German woman who, unlike the others, saw Victoria not as a pawn, but as a person. Together they read fairy tales, history, and poetry by candlelight. Lesen encouraged her to write, to question, to see the world through her own mind rather than through the commands of others. Still, when the doors closed at night, Victoria would sometimes cry quietly, feeling the suffocating presence of Conroy's control and her mother's dependence on him. The Duchess often reminded her daughter of her duty to the crown, though in truth, she feared the royal family that looked down upon her foreign origins. Conroy saw in Victoria a path to power. He imagined himself as the future master of the household, ruling the young queen through influence and fear. He tried to bind her with forced signatures and loyalty oaths, but Victoria, frail as she seemed, resisted him with a silent defiance that no one had expected. By the time she turned 14, the young princess had begun to dream not of crowns or carriages, but of escape. She would look toward the palace gates and imagine a life where she could walk freely, speak her thoughts aloud, and trust without suspicion. Yet even as she longed for freedom, destiny was drawing near, a destiny that would one day lift her from confinement to the most powerful throne on earth, but at a cost she could not yet understand. In the early hours of June 20, 1837, the palace corridors trembled with footsteps. A messenger from Windsor had ridden through the night. King William IV was dead. And with his last breath, the girl who had never been left alone a single moment in her life became the ruler of an empire. Victoria was only 18. She was still sleeping when the Archbishop of Canterbury and Lord Conyngham arrived at Kensington. Her mother rushed to her room, whispering that, "They are here on state business." Victoria rose, wrapped a shawl around her small frame, and received them calmly, barefoot, her hair undone. "I am Queen," she said softly, as if testing the words for the first time. The men bowed low. Outside, London was still unaware. The dawn was gray, the air wet with summer rain, and the streets silent, as though the entire kingdom was holding its breath. But inside, something shifted. The girl who once cried behind locked doors stood taller, steadier. She asked that her mother and Sir John Conroy remain behind. For the first time, she faced the world without them. That morning she moved her bedroom from Kensington Palace to Buckingham, ending years of manipulation with a single command. She refused to make Conroy her secretary or give him any place in her new court. It was an act of quiet rebellion, the first of many. When her ministers came to greet her, they found a young woman pale with determination, her blue eyes sharp and unblinking. They expected a frightened child. Instead, they found a queen. Yet power, she quickly learned, came with its own loneliness. Her mother was distant, the court full of whispering men twice her age, all testing her resolve. "I will be good," she wrote in her journal that night, "but I must be myself." Outside Buckingham Palace, as dawn gave way to sunlight, a single carriage stopped. Crowds began to gather, shouting, "God save the Queen." The sound rolled like a tide through London, the beginning of an age that would one day bear her name. The first months of Victoria's reign were a delicate balancing act between freedom and fear. She was finally alone, yet never truly free. Buckingham Palace echoed with the shuffle of unfamiliar servants, the scent of fresh paint, and the weight of responsibility. The throne room, though grand, felt colder than any prison. At 18, she sat in meetings surrounded by men twice, sometimes thrice her age, politicians who bowed deeply but watched her like hawks. Lord Melbourne, the Prime Minister, was the first to notice the tremor in her voice, the way her hands clenched when others spoke over her. But he also saw something else, resolve. She listened. She learned. She remembered every detail. Soon, their connection grew into something more than political mentorship. Melbourne was charming, fatherly, and patient, and Victoria, who had never known affection without control, found in him a kind of warmth that steadied her. He called her the most interesting young woman in Europe. She called him simply Lord M. Their conversations stretched into late hours. Politics melted into personal counsel. He taught her how to read a man's intentions from the smallest gesture, how to wield silence like a weapon. "You must never show them that you are uncertain," he said once, his voice low. "A queen's pause must look like thought, never fear." Yet the court was not kind to their closeness. Whispers spread that the young queen was too dependent, too naive, too easily swayed. The Duchess of Kent, still bitter over her loss of influence, fed the gossip from the shadows. The old guard of courtiers saw Melbourne's rise as dangerous, improper. But Victoria stood firm. She dismissed those who questioned her and filled her household with ladies of her choosing, girls her own age, who laughed, danced, and breathed life into the palace's somber halls. For the first time, she could walk the corridors without dread. Still, at night, when the candles burned low and the noise of the court faded, she would sit by her window and write in her diary, "They think I am a child. Perhaps I am. But I will not be ruled again." It began with a simple demand, or so it seemed. In May of 1839, Victoria found herself trapped in the storm of her first true political battle. Lord Melbourne's government was faltering, his party losing ground. The Queen, loyal to her mentor, could feel the tide turning but refused to believe he could fall. When he finally came to her, sorrow in his eyes, and told her he must resign, she could barely breathe. The young Queen was asked to summon Sir Robert Peel, leader of the opposing Tory party, to form a new government. Peel was cautious, conservative, and, most dangerously, determined to reshape the court to reflect his own politics. When he entered her chambers, bowing stiffly, he made his condition clear: her ladies of the bedchamber, all daughters, wives, and sisters of Whig politicians, must be replaced with Tory women. For Peel, it was politics. For Victoria, it was betrayal. Her ladies were her only friends, her first circle of warmth and laughter after years of isolation. They had danced with her, comforted her, shared secrets late into candlelit nights. Replacing them meant surrendering her privacy, her heart, her autonomy, a symbolic return to the control she had escaped. She refused. Her tone, though soft, carried a steel that startled Peel. "The Queen cannot part with her ladies," she said. "They are her companions, not her ministers." Peel, offended but bound by propriety, bowed and withdrew. Without the necessary confidence of the crown, he could not form a government. Melbourne was recalled, triumphant, and yet troubled. He saw that his pupil had learned defiance too quickly, that emotion had now become her armor. Across London, the press feasted on the scandal. Pamphlets mocked the girl queen ruled by whims and women. The phrase "the bedchamber crisis" spread like wildfire. Yet the people, surprisingly, stood by her. There was something magnetic about her stubbornness, something that felt human and alive after the chill of her uncle's reigns. Behind the curtains of Buckingham Palace, however, the victory tasted bittersweet. Melbourne warned her gently, "You've won today, ma'am, but every victory has its cost." That night, Victoria stood before her mirror, not the gilded frame, but the reflection of herself within it. For the first time, she saw not a girl, not a puppet, not even a queen, but a young woman learning the loneliness of power. And in her diary, she wrote, "They think I have acted from caprice." But it was not caprice, it was courage. It was a gray November morning when she first saw him again. The memory of Albert, her cousin from the tiny duchy of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, was faint and unfinished, a polite young boy from 4 years ago, awkward and quiet, who had played the piano too earnestly. But now, as he stepped into the grand drawing-room of Windsor Castle, Victoria felt the air shift. Albert had changed. The softness of boyhood had sharpened into purpose, his shoulders broader, his gaze steadier, his features touched by the calm confidence of a man who had already learned restraint. His dark hair was neatly combed, his black uniform immaculate, yet what caught her most was the gentleness behind his eyes, not submission, but thought. They spoke formally at first. Her mother, the Duchess of Kent, hovered at a distance, her expression unreadable. Melbourne observed quietly, perhaps sensing the significance of the moment. The conversation turned from politics to art, from art to music, and then to laughter, light, unforced laughter that surprised even Victoria. That night, she wrote in her diary, "Albert is charming. So sensible, so kind, and with such a sweet countenance. I was quite struck." But affection for a queen was never simple. Every whisper of emotion could ripple into diplomacy, into alliances, into centuries of consequence. The Coburg family, Albert's uncle in particular, had long nurtured the hope that one of their own might become consort of the British crown. And while Victoria's heart trembled with new feeling, her ministers were already weighing treaties, inheritances, and political implications. Still, the heart is stubborn against the language of statecraft. Over the next days, as the rain softened the gardens of Windsor, Victoria and Albert walked together among the damp roses. She noticed the way he observed the smallest things, the curve of a leaf, the quiet hum of bees, as though the world, to him, was not for conquest but understanding. He listened, truly listened, when she spoke of her duties, her loneliness, her fear of being both watched and isolated. And though his words were measured, she could sense the same quiet fire within him, a belief in duty, in moral clarity, in the sanctity of purpose. When he finally left Windsor, her heart felt unexpectedly hollow. The carriage wheels faded into the mist, and she stood at the window long after the last sound was gone. 3 days later, her diary read, "I miss him more than I can say. I believe he is the one." What she didn't yet know was that her decision to follow that belief, to marry for love rather than alliance, would change not only her reign, but the entire shape of monarchy itself. The morning of October 15, 1839, began with mist clinging low to the gardens of Windsor. Victoria rose before dawn, unable to sleep, her pulse quick and uncertain. Albert had returned, summoned not by decree, but by her will. She had told herself it was merely to see if her feelings were true. But deep down, she already knew. Protocol demanded patience. A monarch must not appear impulsive, especially in matters of the heart. And yet, as she paced the room, the weight of her crown felt almost unbearable. She was the most powerful woman in the world, and still, she could not be the one courted. No man could propose to a reigning queen. If she wanted him, she must ask. When he entered, the room brightened. Albert bowed deeply, his composure calm, though his eyes revealed the faintest tremor of emotion. They spoke at first of familiar things, of travel, of music, of his family in Coburg, but the words came hollow, wrapped in the tension between them. Finally, she stopped him mid-sentence. "Albert," she said, her voice trembling, "I must tell you that it is my intention to marry you." The silence that followed seemed to echo. His breath caught, then softened into something like disbelief, not from pride, but reverence. He took her hand and kissed it lightly, his eyes bright. "I will devote my life to your happiness," he said quietly. It was done. There was no grand gesture, no crowd of witnesses, only two young hearts in a quiet room, deciding the future of an empire. Later that day, she wrote, "It was the happiest day of my life." But in that happiness lingered the shadow of a truth she did not yet grasp, that love, when it belongs to a sovereign, becomes both sanctuary and burden. The wedding morning dawned cold and silver. London had dressed itself for celebration, bells rang from every steeple, garlands hung across narrow streets, and crowds pressed close along the procession route, their cheers rising like smoke. For a moment, the city forgot its soot and sorrow. Victoria wore white, not the ivory of tradition, but a luminous white satin trimmed with Huntington lace, a choice that would one day define bridal fashion itself. She refused a crown, choosing instead a wreath of orange blossoms, a symbol of purity and promise. Albert's uniform gleamed with scarlet and gold. He looked every inch a prince, yet his eyes sought only hers. The ceremony at St. James's Palace was solemn and radiant. As they knelt side by side, the great church seemed to hum with the sound of centuries, with expectation, with something close to hope. When they emerged, husband and wife, the clouds broke, and sunlight spilled across the cobblestones. But as day faded to dusk and the cheers of London dimmed, reality began its quiet return. Victoria was still a queen, and Albert, though her equal in spirit, was not her equal in rank. He had no official title, no political power. The ministers were wary of him, the press called him a foreigner, an interloper. He bore it all with patience, with dignity, but in the privacy of their chambers, Victoria saw how it hurt him, this subtle exile inside her own court. She wanted to defend him, to give him authority, but every gesture was scrutinized, every affection politicized. And so their marriage began, two souls bound by love, divided by duty. The warmth of their union would soon meet the cold machinery of empire. The first weeks of their marriage were filled with tenderness, morning walks through the damp gardens of Windsor, shared laughter over breakfast, evenings with piano and candlelight. Victoria felt as though she had found the balance her crown had stolen, the comfort of belonging, the simplicity of being loved not as a monarch, but as a woman. But soon, the palace walls began to whisper again. Ministers muttered behind closed doors. Letters from Parliament arrived heavy with implication. The Queen must not allow herself to be guided by foreign influence. Albert noticed before she did. He could sense the thin layer of ice beneath every polite conversation, the subtle tightening of smiles when he entered the room. His suggestions on art, on industry, even on household reforms, all met resistance, not because they were unwise, but because they came from him. One evening, as rain tapped against the window, Victoria found him sitting alone by the fire, his hand resting on an unopened letter. "They call me ambitious," he said quietly. As though a man cannot wish to serve his wife's country without serving himself. She came to his side, touched his shoulder. "You are my husband," she whispered. "They will see that in time." But he shook his head, the firelight reflecting in his eyes. "Not while I am only that." For the first time, Victoria felt the fault line between love and sovereignty crack open beneath them. She was his wife, yes, but she was also their queen. Every gesture of affection risked accusation. Every shared decision risked scandal. At night, she began to dream of corridors, long, endless corridors, where she walked alone while Albert's voice echoed from behind locked doors. And though she woke to find him beside her, the echo lingered, faint but growing. By 1840, the newspapers had turned venomous. The German prince, they called him, cold, meddlesome, too clever for his place. Satirical prints showed him pulling puppet strings above the Queen's head, his face twisted into a smile she did not recognize. Victoria's ministers fed the flame. Lord Melbourne, her mentor and confidant, grew increasingly cautious around Albert. He is intelligent, yes, he told her gently, but intelligence must be kept from influence. She listened, she always listened to Melbourne, but his words began to sound less like guidance and more like warning. And when she defended Albert in council, the room chilled instantly, like frost creeping over glass. The pressure built silently. Her letters became shorter, her handwriting sharper. In her private diary, she wrote, "They do not see what I see. They do not see his goodness." Albert withdrew from court life, devoting himself to the sciences, to architecture, to causes no one could accuse him of politicizing. Yet every act of retreat only deepened her isolation. The more he stepped back, the more she felt herself surrounded by men who smiled and bowed but doubted her strength. One evening, in a rare flash of anger, she struck her hand against the table. "I am Queen of England," she cried. "And still they treat me as though I were a child." Albert said nothing. He only looked at her with quiet sorrow, the kind that knows love cannot shield someone from their own battle. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky, as if to echo her fury. But when she turned to face him again, her voice had softened. "They will learn," she said. "We both will." It was not a promise. It was a beginning. When the bells of Buckingham Palace rang in November of 1840, their sound rolled like a hymn across the fog-wrapped city. Crowds gathered outside the palace gates, straining to see the windows where candles burned through the night. At dawn, the announcement came, a daughter, the Princess Royal. For Victoria, the first cry of her child was both salvation and terror. She had ruled a kingdom, but this was something she could not command, the trembling fragility of a life entirely dependent on her. When the nurse placed the infant in her arms, she saw not just a daughter, but the future of her dynasty. Albert stood beside her, his hand trembling slightly as he touched the baby's cheek. "She has your mouth," he said softly. Victoria smiled, though exhaustion blurred her vision. "Then she will have much to say." The birth softened public opinion, for a time. The image of the young queen holding her child became a symbol of domestic virtue, the ideal of family Britain wanted to see reflected in its sovereign. Newspapers spoke of the royal home, as if it were a small English cottage rather than the axis of empire. But inside those gilded walls, shadows still moved. Motherhood changed her, made her fiercer, more emotional, sometimes even cruelly impatient. She adored her child, but she also felt imprisoned by her own tenderness. In her diary she confessed, "I love her dearly, but I cannot always love the weight of her." Albert, ever the reformer, took to fatherhood with precise devotion. He studied child-care manuals, consulted physicians, arranged the nursery with scientific care. The people praised his gentleness, yet in court, whispers grew louder. "The Queen reigns, but the Prince governs." Victoria noticed the way his confidence expanded. It was not arrogance, not yet, but something like quiet conquest. She loved him for his order, but feared it too. At night, when the palace finally slept, she would walk the corridors alone, listening to the ticking of the clocks. Time was already moving faster than she could bear. And outside, beyond the gaslit streets, her empire grew restless, as if sensing that beneath the cradle's soft lullaby, history itself was shifting. There was a mirror in Victoria's private chamber, tall, framed in gilt, its glass warped slightly with age. She often paused before it, half-dressed, her crown resting nearby on the velvet stand. In that reflection, she saw two women, one who ruled an empire, and one who longed to be simply loved. Albert's influence was now undeniable. His reform projects multiplied: sanitation, science, education, and the nation adored him for it. The Prince of Progress, they called him. Victoria smiled in public, but in private, she felt the sting of invisibility. Once, after a council meeting, she said sharply, "They look to you now, not to me." Albert turned, startled. "You are the sovereign." "I merely advise." "Advise," she laughed, brittle, cold. "You build. You change. You act. I am left to bless your labors as if I were some gilded statue." He reached for her hand, but she drew back. The silence that followed was heavy, a silence of love bruised by pride. Still, she could not truly resent him. Each time she watched him with their child, the gentleness of his voice, the patience in his eyes, something inside her melted. Yet the mirror saw what she would not name, her heart's dependence on the very man who was eroding her power. The tension wove itself into their daily life, subtle but persistent. He would correct her tone in letters, rearrange her schedule, refine her public image. "For the good of the monarchy," he'd say. And she believed him, mostly. But one evening, as the rain lashed the palace windows, she stood again before the mirror and whispered, "If the crown is his burden to shape, what remains of mine?" The reflection offered no comfort. It only shimmered with candlelight, and somewhere deep within it, the faint outline of another Victoria seemed to be watching her, silent and knowing. Outside, London's streets glistened under the storm. And in that restless night, a queen began to understand that every empire, even one built on devotion, demands its price. By the early 1850s, the empire glittered like a jewel in the crown of the world, vast, prosperous, proud. Yet within the heart of Buckingham Palace, its sovereign felt the walls closing in. The people's adoration was cooling. Newspapers once filled with praise now whispered of arrogance, of a queen too distant, too ruled by her German husband. Victoria read the clippings in secret, her hands trembling slightly. "They call me cold, Albert," she murmured. "As though a heart can rule an empire." Albert tried to reassure her, gently, rationally, always the voice of reason. "Public favor is the tide, my dear. It ebbs and flows. Only duty remains constant." But duty had become a chain around her spirit. There were mornings she could not rise, unable to face the endless briefings, the ceremonies that blurred into monotony. Her ladies whispered of melancholy, her physicians muttered of nervous exhaustion. Yet she refused rest. "A sovereign does not falter," she would say, though her eyes betrayed her fatigue. Outside the palace, a new force was stirring, the voices of reform, demanding more rights for workers, more say in governance. The age of unchallenged monarchy was fading, and Victoria felt it like a chill wind through her corridors. At a council meeting, a minister spoke bluntly, "Your Majesty, the people look to Parliament now. We must modernize, or risk unrest." The word struck her like a slap. Modernize, as if tradition were an illness to be cured. That evening, she sat alone at her writing desk, staring at a blank page. She wanted to write to Albert, to confess her fear that history might forget her, that she might become a symbol, not a soul. Instead, she wrote only one line in her diary. "They demand progress, but it feels like erasure." And yet, in the quiet that followed, she realized something profound. Perhaps her power was not in command, but in endurance. In surviving the change. In embodying continuity when everything else was shifting. The next morning, she dressed not in royal splendor, but in simple black, an image of restraint, of steadiness. As she stepped onto the balcony to greet the crowds, the cheers were hesitant at first, then grew stronger. The people saw not the aloof monarch of rumor, but a woman, steady, serious, unbending in the storm. And in that moment, beneath the gray London sky, Victoria rediscovered her place, not above her people, but within their story. In the spring of 1851, London awoke to the sound of hammers and dreams. The world was being built anew, quite literally, in Hyde Park. A vast structure of glass and iron was rising, shimmering like a vision from the future. It was Prince Albert's creation, the Great Exhibition, a celebration of industry, art, and human achievement. Victoria watched it take shape with a mixture of awe and quiet apprehension. "It looks almost unreal," she told Albert one morning, gazing through the mist. "Like something out of a fairy tale." He smiled, proud and radiant. "It is the future, my love, our future." When the opening day came, the Queen entered the Crystal Palace to the sound of thousands of voices and the hum of wonder. Beneath the glass canopy, sunlight poured over machines from America, silks from India, clocks from Switzerland, and inventions no one had ever seen before. The world had gathered beneath her gaze. As she walked through the aisles, the air was electric, not with fear or submission, but with admiration. The people saw her anew, not the distant ruler, but the face of progress, the embodiment of a nation stepping boldly into modernity. When Albert gave his speech, eloquent, idealistic, filled with hope for human unity, Victoria felt tears rise in her eyes. For a moment, she saw him not as her husband or her prince, but as a man who believed that beauty and science could change the world. That night, she wrote in her diary, "Albert has built a palace of glass, but within it, he has reflected my heart. Yet, even amidst triumph, shadows lingered. The very glass that symbolized openness also felt fragile." There were whispers in Parliament that the exhibition had made Albert too powerful, that the people admired him more than their queen. And deep down, Victoria felt a flicker of fear. What happens when one's crown begins to gleam less brightly beside another's brilliance? After the exhibition's success, the balance between Victoria and Albert began to shift. Once, she had been the center of every room, every decision. Now, ministers deferred to him, his intellect, his vision, his tireless order. At dinners, she would watch as Albert debated politics with members of Parliament, his tone measured, persuasive, irresistible. She admired him, and resented him all at once. One evening, after a particularly tense council session, she confronted him. "They look to you now, Albert. Even for matters that are mine to decide." He looked at her kindly, almost paternally. "You are the heart, Victoria. I am only the hand that steadies it." But his words, meant as comfort, cut deep. She didn't want to be merely the heart, soft, emotional, symbolic. She was a monarch. Yet, increasingly, the machinery of empire seemed to run on Albert's energy, not hers. And in the quiet hours, she noticed another change. Albert was often gone, absorbed in his projects, his studies, his plans for reform. Their evenings, once full of laughter and music, grew still. Even his gaze, when it rested on her, seemed to hold the distance of duty rather than desire. Her letters from this time became filled with contradictions, devotion laced with jealousy, pride laced with loneliness. She wrote to her daughter once, "Your father's mind is magnificent. But sometimes I wish it would rest upon me, just once more." Outside the palace, the world was changing faster than ever. Railways stretched across the countryside, the telegraph connected continents, revolutions trembled in Europe. The queen who had once symbolized strength now felt herself slipping into the background of her own reign. And yet, she would not fade quietly. Beneath the composure of her portraits, a fire still smoldered, the same one that had crowned a young girl at 18 and made her queen of an empire. She would not let history forget her. Not yet. By the winter of 1861, the palace had grown strangely silent. The laughter that once echoed through its halls, children's voices, Albert's piano, the hum of family, now felt distant, as if swallowed by the London fog. Albert had changed. The vibrancy that once radiated from him seemed to fade. He was paler now, thinner, his cough persistent. Yet, he insisted on working. "There is too much to do," he would tell Victoria, pushing aside her concern with a weary smile. "A country doesn't pause because I am unwell." But Victoria saw the truth in his eyes, the quiet fatigue, the pain he tried to mask. She hovered beside him constantly, half monarch, half nurse, torn between her duties and her dread. Then came December. News reached them that their son, the Prince of Wales, had been involved in a scandal at Cambridge, a reckless escapade with friends, one that had embarrassed the crown. Albert, already weakened, insisted on traveling north to confront him. The journey broke him. He returned to Windsor pale as snow, fever burning through his body. Victoria, alarmed, summoned physicians. They called it typhoid fever, though no one dared tell her how grave it truly was. In the long nights that followed, she refused to leave his side. She wiped his brow, held his hand, whispered prayers into the darkness. Her diary entries grew frantic. "My angel is ill. I cannot lose him." Outside, Christmas approached, but the palace felt frozen in mourning. Servants moved quietly. Ministers sent letters in hushed tones. Even the bells of Windsor seemed to toll slower, heavier. Albert looked at her one night, his voice a soft rasp. "You must be strong, Victoria. Promise me you will not let sorrow destroy you." She wept, shaking her head. I cannot exist without you. You are my life, Albert, my soul. He smiled faintly. Then live for me. Those were among his last words. On December 14, 1861, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, husband, father, reformer, dreamer, died in his bed at Windsor Castle. And something in Victoria, perhaps the light itself, died with him. For months after Albert's death, the palace remained shrouded in black. Curtains drawn, mirrors covered, clocks stopped at the hour of his passing. Victoria refused to appear in public. Ministers begged her to return to her duties, but she would not listen. I am no longer queen, she wrote. I am his widow. Every day, she visited his room, untouched, preserved as if he might walk in at any moment. His dressing gown hung on its hook, his papers remained on the desk. She spoke to him aloud, believing he could hear her. Good morning, my dearest. I hope you are near me still. The people grew restless. Newspapers called her the Invisible Queen. Rumors spread that she had gone mad, that she communed with spirits, that she had abandoned her nation. But Victoria cared little for opinion. Her world had narrowed to the size of a memory. In letters to her children, she confessed a grief so vast it seemed to erase time. All seems dead and gone, even the past feels lost without him. And yet, amid this shadow, a strange transformation began. Her pain became ritual, her mourning, devotion. She began to turn sorrow into something sacred. Albert's image appeared everywhere, in statues, paintings, jewelry, architecture. She commissioned memorials in his name, as if by engraving his face into stone, she could make him eternal. The grandest of all was the Royal Albert Memorial, a towering tribute to his life and ideals, rising in the heart of London. She oversaw every detail, every inscription. He must be remembered as the purest, noblest of men, she said. The world must never forget what I have lost. But beneath the grandeur of mourning lay a quieter truth. Victoria's love had turned into her armor. Grief became her crown, and solitude, her kingdom. The queen who had once ruled with confidence and warmth was gone. In her place stood the widow of Windsor, a figure of shadow and iron, adored and feared in equal measure. Years slipped away like mist along the Thames. For more than a decade, Queen Victoria lived in near seclusion, a monarch cloaked in black, a ghost haunting her own reign. Ministers came and went, governments rose and fell, yet she remained behind her veiled windows, writing letters to a man who no longer answered. The people of Britain, once tender in sympathy, began to murmur. The press grew bold, accusing her of neglect, of cowardice, even of treason against her duty. Pamphlets called her the recluse of Windsor. Some whispered that she would never return. But grief, like winter, does not last forever. Slowly, something within her began to stir, a flicker of purpose, faint but insistent. It began, perhaps, with the soft insistence of her Prime Minister, Benjamin Disraeli, whose charm and poetic wit reached her where others could not. He spoke to her not merely as a ruler, but as a woman who had once loved deeply. "You are the heart of this nation, ma'am," he told her. "If you hide it away, the people's heart will falter too." And then there was Scotland, her refuge. At Balmoral, among heathered hills and quiet lochs, she found something close to peace. The crisp air and the silence reminded her of a simpler world, where duty did not press so heavily. There she met John Brown, her devoted Highland servant, blunt, loyal, unafraid of her sorrow. He called her woman instead of Your Majesty, and though the court was scandalized, Victoria found comfort in his honesty. With his help, she began to live again. She rode horses through misty valleys, visited villages, spoke with her tenants. For the first time in years, she laughed, a sound that startled even herself. When she finally returned to London in the 1870s, the crowds that gathered were immense. Some wept, others simply stared, unsure if the figure before them was truly their queen or a spirit reborn. She waved gently, her face lined, her expression grave but calm. A single cheer broke out, then another, and soon, the city thundered with joy. Victoria had returned. Not the radiant girl who had once danced at her coronation, nor the grieving widow locked away in shadow, but something stronger, deeper. A monarch reborn through sorrow. By the late 19th century, Britain stood at its zenith, the largest empire the world had ever known. Ships bearing her flag sailed to every continent, carrying tea, silk, guns, and dreams of dominion. In London, industrial smoke rose like incense to power. In far-off lands, explorers carved the Queen's name into maps newly drawn. And through it all, Victoria reigned, no longer the hidden widow, but the grandmother of Europe, a symbol of endurance and might. Yet beneath the splendor of her empire, contradictions grew. Factories roared, but children labored in their shadows. Palaces gleamed, while colonies starved. Britain was rich beyond measure, but restless, uncertain of its conscience. Victoria felt the weight of this duality. In her journals, she wrote of the pride and pain of rule. She loved her empire, its languages, its vastness, its promise, but she also feared its arrogance. "We are responsible," she noted once, "for souls as well as soil." Her family became the empire's mirror. Her 9 children married into nearly every royal house of Europe, creating a web of alliances that would later define, and fracture, the continent. At her table, Russian princes, German dukes, and Danish queens shared laughter and tension in equal measure. Despite her age, Victoria worked tirelessly. She met ambassadors, signed reforms, and continued to shape the moral character of her nation. But her heart never left the quiet hills of Balmoral, nor the memory of Albert, whose portrait still stood beside her bed. At night, she would sit by the fire, her black gown gleaming faintly in the glow, and whisper to the painting, "You would be proud, my dearest, our work endures." The empire stretched across oceans, but for Victoria, it was always about one thing: legacy. Not merely power or conquest, but the endurance of love, the belief that what is built from devotion can outlast grief, time, and even death itself. The final decades of Victoria's reign unfolded like a slow-turning wheel of wonder and change. The world she had inherited as a young queen, a world of horses, candles, and handwritten letters, had transformed into one of steamships, telegraphs, and the electric light. The empire no longer merely expanded across seas, it was stitched together by invisible threads of wire, carrying words faster than ships could sail. When the first message crossed the Atlantic cable, she was among the first to send greetings to the President of the United States, a brief, stately message, yet history's quiet proof that distance itself was shrinking. "May the union between our nations be perpetual," she wrote. The irony was unspoken. Her own family had once ruled those distant shores. New technologies fascinated her, though she never quite trusted them. She marveled at photographs but preferred portraits. She tolerated trains but missed the stillness of carriage rides. Yet she understood their power. "They make us gods of time," she remarked once, gazing at a flickering light bulb. But even gods must rest. Her image, once a rare sight on coin and stamp, became ubiquitous. Statues rose in her likeness from India to Canada, Australia to Africa. Schoolchildren sang her name, soldiers toasted her health, and journalists coined a term that would outlast her, the Victorian age. And yet, despite all the grandeur, she remained curiously human. She wept for her grandchildren, who died of fevers. She laughed when her small dog ran through state chambers during an audience. She continued to write daily in her journals, her handwriting still tight, neat, unmistakably precise. Visitors to her court often left with a strange feeling that they had met both a monarch and a woman who had outlived herself. One French diplomat described her as a living monument, both sacred and melancholy. She ruled over a world both vast and fragile, and though her influence reached across continents, her heart was still tethered to two small places, a drawing room at Windsor and a quiet lodge in Balmoral, where Albert's voice seemed, sometimes, to whisper still. As the century neared its end, so too did the Queen's long journey. Her hair, once the color of autumn wheat, had turned to snow. Her face, now deeply lined, bore the map of her reign, triumph and loss etched in equal measure. Yet her eyes, blue and steady, had not dulled. They saw farther than most, into the past she had lived and the future she would never see. London was electric now, alive with motion and sound. Automobiles sputtered down cobbled streets, suffragists shouted in public squares, and the Empire's reach continued to both awe and strain the world. The Queen watched it all from her windows, her expression unreadable. She had seen her share of progress and sorrow, revolutions, inventions, and wars. She had met the first photographers and the first filmmakers. Once, near the end, a young man showed her a moving image, soldiers marching, their shadows flickering on a wall. She gasped softly. "It is as though ghosts have learned to walk again," she murmured. Her own ghosts were many now. John Brown was gone. So were Disraeli, her loyal ministers, half her children. Yet she endured, bound to life by the quiet conviction that her duty was not yet finished. On the night of her 80th birthday, she stood before the mirror in Windsor Castle. The jewels she wore, diamonds, sapphires, and pearls, glimmered like frozen time. "How strange," she whispered, "to have lived so long that even the past seems to bow." But even as her body weakened, her mind remained sharp. She read dispatches, advised her ministers, and oversaw ceremonies with unwavering precision. The Empire watched her like a daughter watches her aging mother, anxious, reverent, unprepared for goodbye. And in her last winter, when the fog over London thickened and the bells rang slower, she wrote one final note to her private secretary. "Let there be no mourning, only remembrance. For what is life but service, and what is service but love enduring?" The twilight deepened. The century turned. and the world waited for the queen who had ruled its heart for 60 years, to finally rest. The news spread like a hush rolling across the world. In late January of 1901, in the grey quiet of Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, Queen Victoria, the woman who had once embodied an age, was dying. The royal household moved through the corridors as though underwater, their footsteps softened by carpets, their voices lowered to whispers. Outside, a light snow had fallen, dissolving on the windowsills like fading breath. She had been ill for weeks, slipping in and out of sleep. Even in her final days, she continued to receive notes and messages from across the empire, soldiers, children, widows, even distant kings. Many wrote not to the monarch, but to the woman, "Thank you for your steadfastness. Thank you for our queen." Her children gathered at her bedside. The Prince of Wales, soon to be King Edward VII, stood closest, his face drawn with guilt and awe. He had waited his whole life for a crown he did not want to receive this way. Her daughters wept quietly. One of them held her hand, the same small, strong hand that had once signed treaties, blessed regiments, and written endless letters to a world she would never fully know. Her breathing had grown shallow, rhythmic like the tide outside her window. On the bedside table lay a few small things: a lock of Albert's hair in a locket, John Brown's photograph, a sprig of heather from Balmoral, and a handkerchief embroidered with her initials, VRI, Victoria Regina Imperatrix. As twilight fell, the chaplain whispered a prayer. Her lips moved faintly, following the familiar words, "Thy will be done." And then, with one last exhale, quiet, unhurried, dignified, she was gone. The moment seemed to pause the entire world. Clocks stopped in palaces, bells tolled in cities, flags lowered from Delhi to Ottawa. The British Empire, vast, sprawling, unstoppable, felt suddenly small, fragile, mortal. That night, in the dim hall of Osborne House, a single candle flickered beside her bed. The servant said the flame did not waver, even as the wind pressed against the glass. It was as if the century itself was holding its breath. Her funeral was not merely a ceremony, it was an elegy for an age. The empire mourned in unison, a rhythm of grief echoing across continents. Telegrams arrived faster than they could be read, from emperors, presidents, poets, and paupers. The people who had never seen her face in person felt as though they had lost a grandmother. The body of the Queen lay in state at Osborne before being carried aboard the Royal Yacht Alberta. The sea was still, as if paying respect. Soldiers lined the shores in silent rows, rifles lowered. In London, hundreds of thousands filled the streets, their black coats glistening with mist. Many brought flowers, violets, lilies, and roses, the same blooms she had loved in her youth. But this was no funeral of despair. She had left strict instructions: no black horses, no dirges, no grimness. "Let it be white," she had written, "and let them remember the light." So her coffin was draped not in somber velvet, but in white satin and gold. The cortege glimmered with pale banners, the music soft but not mournful. Even the soldiers, hardened by wars fought in her name, felt their throats tighten as the carriage passed. In Windsor, the procession slowed. The bells of St. George's Chapel tolled low and patient. The Prince of Wales, now Edward VII, followed on foot, his face grey beneath his hat. Behind him walked Wilhelm II, the German Kaiser, her grandson, a reminder that the Queen's bloodline now ran through half the crowned heads of Europe. When the coffin was lowered beside Albert's in the Frogmore Mausoleum, the light of late afternoon fell through the stained glass, turning everything gold. For a moment, it seemed as though she was merely resting, waiting to wake and continue her endless letters, her endless reign. Outside, the crowd stood in silence. The empire had not only lost a ruler, it had lost its mother, its measure, its mirror. And in that silence, the 20th century began to breathe. The young Queen Victoria awoke one morning in her private chambers at Buckingham Palace, sunlight spilling across her shawl, reminding her that the world beyond her nursery windows was now hers to command. At 18, the crown rested lightly on her head but heavily on her heart. The halls she had once walked under strict observation now echoed with her own footsteps. Every decision, from appointments of ministers to the arrangement of her household, was hers to make, yet with power came isolation. Her first true political challenge arrived quietly, in whispers and letters. The bedchamber crisis tested her resolve. Her ladies of the bedchamber, her companions and confidants, were to be replaced with Tory women. Victoria's heart clenched. These women had been her only bridge to the world of ordinary life. She refused. Firmly, quietly, her small frame radiating unexpected authority, she held her ground. Lord Melbourne, her mentor, watched with pride. The girl he had guided was no longer merely obedient, she was sovereign. Even as London began to stir with gossip, Victoria found moments of solace in her private studies, reading, and quiet walks through the palace gardens. The young queen learned that leadership required patience and discretion, yet she would never yield her mind or spirit to fear. Amid political maneuverings, a new presence entered her life, Albert, her cousin from Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. Their first meeting at Windsor Castle was formal, polite, yet something in his steady gaze caught Victoria off guard. Conversation flowed, first of music, art, and books, then laughter, and finally, a quiet understanding. By October 1839, Victoria's heart spoke before protocol could intervene. She declared her intention to marry Albert, defying the careful political calculations that governed royal unions. Their union was solemn but intimate, a partnership of intellect, care, and devotion. In private, Albert's steadiness became her anchor, though the palace remained rife with whispers. Ministers, journalists, and courtiers all questioned the place of a foreign prince beside the sovereign. Together, they navigated the delicate balance of affection and authority. Albert's influence would grow, shaping reform, culture, and industry, while Victoria learned to wield her crown not only through command but through subtle, unyielding presence. Their love was private, steadfast, and quietly revolutionary, blending the personal and the political in ways the empire would slowly recognize. The first cry of Victoria's daughter, the Princess Royal, was a revelation. Motherhood added new dimensions to her reign, love and tenderness mingled with fear and exhaustion. Albert's methodical approach to family life brought stability, yet also subtle tension. His competence sometimes cast long shadows, making Victoria keenly aware of her own limitations. Together, they celebrated triumphs and endured grief. They lost children to disease, faced political turbulence, and navigated the expansion of the empire. The birth of heirs intertwined personal joy with public responsibility, each child a symbol of continuity and duty. Victoria's diaries reflected the delicate tightrope she walked: pride and sorrow, tenderness and vigilance, love and sovereignty. December 1861 changed everything. Albert's death left Victoria in profound isolation. For over a decade, she cloaked herself in black, retreating to Windsor and Balmoral, her grief shaping her public and private life. She refused to appear at court, delegating tasks but never relinquishing authority, while the people whispered about the invisible queen. Yet, mourning became ritual, and ritual became strength. She commissioned memorials, from private portraits to the Royal Albert Memorial, ensuring that his vision and values endured. Life returned slowly, aided by trusted servants, loyal ministers like Benjamin Disraeli, and the quiet Scottish landscapes of Balmoral. Victoria learned to live again within her sorrow, channeling loss into resilience and continued service to her empire. By the 1870s, Victoria had emerged from seclusion, returning to London as a monarch tempered by grief and experience. She oversaw industrial progress, international diplomacy, and social reform. The Great Exhibition of 1851, Albert's crowning achievement, remained a testament to their shared vision of a modern, enlightened empire. Even as she aged, Victoria retained sharp intellect, precise judgment, and an unyielding sense of duty. She mourned Albert daily, yet channeled love and devotion into her children, grandchildren, and the empire itself. By the final years of her life, Victoria had become a living symbol of endurance, morality, and continuity, the grandmother of Europe, the witness to progress, and the steadfast heart of a global empire. Her death in 1901, at Osborne House, closed a chapter not only of a remarkable life but of a world transformed under her reign. The empire mourned, yet her legacy endured, in reforms, in architecture, in family alliances, and in the very spirit of an age that bore her name. Victoria's story reminds us that the weight of a crown is measured not only in authority, but in resilience, love, and the courage to endure both sorrow and triumph. As the candles flickered in Windsor's quiet halls, and the snow lay soft upon the garden paths, Victoria closed her eyes for the night, her thoughts heavy with decades of triumph and sorrow. She had loved, lost, ruled, and endured, yet still, the world seemed vast and unknowable. If you could, whisper a gentle thought for her, a small reminder that even the most steadfast hearts sometimes need a guiding hand, a quiet touch to remind them they are not alone. For in dreams, perhaps, even a queen may find counsel, comfort, and courage.